Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. Our next guest is author Steve Fraser. He's written a lot of great books on the subjects of politics and economics, including Every Man is a Speculator, and he is a frequent contributor to some good publications, including Salon, Truth Out, Alternate, and TomDispatch.com. His new book is an important one, in my opinion. It is called The Age of Acquiescence, and he's here to talk about it now with us. Steve Fraser, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, bear with me here because I'm having a little audio problem, which I will try to work through as we speak. But
Sure.
Listen, so your book takes on the topic of why it is in this world, as we've seen growing inequality and growing economic injustice, why, I don't want to paraphrase too badly, but why are we putting up with it? And what do you think? I don't want to do injustice to a full book by asking for a thumbnail answer, but what's the thumbnail answer?
That's an excellent paraphrase. It is a complicated answer. I think there are many things that account for that. But if I had to pinpoint one thing, and that's what you're really asking me to do, I would say that we're acquiescent today compared to the way our ancestors back in the first Gilded Age in the 19th century reacted to the same set of circumstances: inequality and exploitation and rule by the rich and powerful, is because back then people had a rather robust and varied conception of how life might be organized differently. That is to say, they were farmers or handicraftsmen or peasants from Eastern and Southern Europe, or small businessmen, professionals of various kinds, all of whom had grown up in the 19th century when capitalism, industrial capitalism, first made its debut in America. And they all were familiar with other ways of life, other ways that society and the economy might be organized. And as a consequence, they were both desperate because those earlier forms of existence and ways of life were going out of existence at the hands of industrial capitalism. They were all being converted into what back in the day they used to call wage slaves. But on the other hand, because they knew that capitalism was not a fate but a choice, they also could envision other ways of living, and they called it the cooperative commonwealth, or they called it socialism, or they called it the Christian commonwealth, or the anti-monopoly movement imagined a society of producers not dominated by the great corporations. In other words, they had visions, real visions, rooted in historical reality about a different kind of life. Then if you fast forward 100 years or 150 years into our own sort of recent last 50 years, those alternatives are gone. We all accept, or most of us accept, that capitalism, and no longer industrial, but finance capitalism, which rules the show today, is the only possibility, is a fate. And we've all long since been converted into, we're embarrassed by the notion of wage slaves. We're all wage workers nowadays and can't envision anything other than this. And therefore we may strive to make conditions under that form of society as good as we can, but we're not excited by the prospect of something new. And I think there are many, many factors that account for our acquiescence today, but if you insist that I choose one, it's that.
Well, it's interesting because in a sense what you're describing, and I've thought about this myself, but I think you put it very, very well. What you're describing is a failure of imagination, that in a sense we acquiesce because we can't, and maybe that sounds, maybe that's too harsh toward the public. I don't mean to be harsh necessarily, but in a sense, we don't have a mental model in our imagination of a better world the way people might have during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We are, and I don't think it's too harsh. That is to say, the notion that the free market and that market economics are the only way to organize our lives, and that the free market is the equivalent of freedom. And obviously the credo of our society is dedicated to that proposition, has sunk such deep roots into our national culture, into the national psyche, that it obscures any possibility of something different than that. And you can only fully look. There's resistance today. I would be a fool to pretend that there isn't. Of course there is. Occupy Wall Street was probably the most dramatic, theatrical form of that resistance, but there are plenty of others that have been going on for a long time. It's only when you compare what we're living through today to what our ancestors were capable of doing 100 years ago that you see how striking the lack of that alternative is. For example, today, imagination often is expressed verbally, in language, in literature. So, for example, look at our vocabulary today, how purged it is of words and metaphors that used to be commonplace in America. For example, class struggle, plutocracy, robber barons, how the other half lives. All these kinds of notions were commonplace in 19th century America. People might not like them, or they might say, well, we're really not a nation of two nations. Class struggle is a bad thing. But they accepted that that was a reality you had to deal with. But by mid-20th and late 20th century America, most of that language had been cleansed from our vocabulary. And a philosopher once said that language is the house of being. And if you strip the furniture of that house, if you eliminate the furniture, you're kind of homeless, or you can only live in a certain room, in the kind of windowless room of the current event. You have no perspective. Look at our presidents, for example. Right on through from Lincoln to Theodore Roosevelt to Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt, all these men, and they were certainly not leftists, they were all familiar with the language that I'm talking about. Woodrow Wilson in 1912 ran for president. The chief core of his campaign was running against the power of what was then known as the money trust. These were the big investment banks on Wall Street, and their enormous not only economic power but the way that they were subverting democracy. Theodore Roosevelt denounced malefactors of great wealth. He didn't bend his knee to the rich. He said, look, they're successful in their fields of pursuit, but they're not the savants. They're not the leaders of our society. He said, I much more admire scientists and explorers and other people than I do these rich men. Lincoln, during the Civil War, said these Wall Street speculators who are buying up and then short selling Union bonds because they expect a Union victory and are counting on it, should be shot. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of course, is famous for talking about economic royalists and Tories.
I welcome their hatred.
And said, can you imagine a president since Roosevelt, or maybe since Truman, saying that? Not only did he talk about them, he said, they hate me, and I welcome their hatred.
I welcome their hatred. Now, we're talking with author Steve Fraser about his book, The Age of Acquiescence. This gets to a topic that I cover a lot on this show and in my writing, which is we don't say we admire the scientists, the doctors, the researchers, the teachers, the adventurers, the explorers, whatever. We, the admiration that our culture dedicates to Silicon Valley billionaires or Wall Street speculators or whatever. These have become the new American heroes. I'm wondering whether people don't rise up because they think, well, who knows? I may be the next.
I think you're absolutely right. I think on the one hand, especially beginning in the 1980s and afterwards, these kinds of people, what used to be called titans of industry and finance, became popular heroes. Back in the 19th century, they were frightening figures, but there was no shortage of resistance to them. In the 80s, suddenly they became populist in pinstripes. They were going to save the nation. The country was a kind of in economic decline. Germany and Japan were exceeding American industry, et cetera, and so forth. And these guys said, we're going to save the economy. And in their own way, they did. You know how they did it? They deindustrialized the country. They stripped all of its assets by doing the mergers and acquisitions and leveraged buyouts and junk bond deals that they did in the 80s and 90s and since then. But they were so admired by the media as kind of guys who were self-reliant and had built up their fortunes on their own and were leading the nation, and this became a kind of civic religion in America. And then, of course, one reason they became popular, and this goes way back, it's in the American grain, is what you said, that every American, the birthright of every American is to dream, however foolishly, that he or she too may become that titan. That the chance that he may do that, either speculating in Wall Street or by starting a business of his own in some other field, is always there. That's part of the great American dream. And however unrealistic that is for most people, and increasingly unrealistic.
Exactly, yeah.
It abides. The dream abides, and it makes people acquiesce.
Right, and people, even it's their entertainment, life, beginning with, I blame it all on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I think when that show came out, all of a sudden you couldn't have a new Michael Harrington writing about the other America, because everybody lived in the wealthy America in their minds.
Right,
and that somehow that was a channel of escape.
I call it Wall Street are us. It's like we're
exactly.
We're all part of that game. And in fact, games, actual board games and electronic games proliferated in the 80s and 90s, celebrating all of that. And little kids, 5-year-olds were playing at becoming Wall Street speculators. I mean, this became a national pastime. You couldn't go to a baseball game without seeing along the bottom of the scoreboard the latest stock ticker numbers, competing for your attention with, ball strikes, outs, and innings. I mean, this became the national pastime, and it's always been there in America, but it reached a kind of crescendo during the course of this last generation, and encouraged this kind of adulation for people that never used to be treated with that kind of reverence.
Now, okay, so I couldn't agree more. Clearly, we're on the same page. By the way, I covered a mindfulness conference a couple of years ago where everyone was idealizing Steve Jobs and the other Silicon Valley millionaires, and nobody was very mindful of the Chinese factory workers.
Right. Yes, that's right. Well, thank you for saying that, because I wanted to talk about another aspect of this acquiescence, and that is fear. People acquiesce sometimes because they're true believers, they're credulous, but also because they fear things. And the Chinese factory example of Apple that you mentioned is a good example of what I mean. First of all, we are a developed country that is undergoing a process of underdevelopment, and that means a number of things. It means that 40 million Americans now work for poverty-level wages. That's extraordinary. It used to be in the 19th century quite common to associate poverty with exploitation at work. Then that vanished. And when Michael Harrington, the guy you referred to, wrote his book, he really wasn't talking about poverty at work. He was talking about poverty as a function of being excluded from work, like in Appalachia or in African American ghettos and so on. But now, again, in our age of acquiescence, we're looking at poverty due to exploitation at work. And when you're subjected to that, it's very difficult to rise up. The job is precarious. It may be moved abroad. Say to China, your boss is in command. He's cutting every conceivable kind of fringe benefit, whether it's vacations or pensions or holidays. Unions have become a pale shadow of what they once were, so you don't have the instruments any longer to defend yourself. If you're an immigrant, God forbid you're an immigrant and undocumented, you've got to be constantly looking over your shoulder to see if, either your boss or federal authorities are going to deport you or your family. All of these are elements of fear. There's an enormous surveillance network at work today, electronic surveillance. People, every keystroke is being counted.
Every keystroke. Sometimes, if you have a corporate cell phone, where you are.
Yeah.
And I am writing now, by the way, a longer piece about FICO scores and how they control your credit rating. So I'm afraid. We're going to have to leave it there, but I've got to say we are absolutely on the same page about this. It's great to talk to you about it, and I strongly recommend that people read your book. Steve Fraser's new book is The Age of Acquiescence. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.